Italy, April 1945. On a bare mountain ridge swept by German machine gun fire, a young American lieutenant lay bleeding from a wound in his stomach, his right arm hanging shattered and useless at his side. Clenched in the fingers of that ruined arm was a live hand grenade, its pin already pulled, ready to explode. With his left hand, he reached across, pried the grenade loose from his own dying fingers, and threw it into the enemy bunker ahead. Then he picked up his gun and kept fighting. His name was Daniel Inouye, and the country he was bleeding for had branded him an enemy. Daniel Inouye was 20 years old, a son of Hawaii, an American born and raised. He had once dreamed of becoming a surgeon. Instead, on that ridge, he would lose the very arm he had hoped to heal others with. He was fighting in one of the most decorated units in the entire history of the United States Army, a regiment of Japanese-American soldiers who had volunteered to prove their loyalty in blood, and here was the cruel heart of their story. While these young men fought and died for America in Europe, tens of thousands of their own families were locked behind barbed wire in camps back home, imprisoned by the very nation they were dying to defend. It is one of the most extraordinary and painful stories of the Second World War. How did the son of Japanese immigrants come to be branded an enemy alien on the morning of Pearl Harbor and then end up storming a German machine gun nest with a grenade in his shattered hand 4 years later? How did a unit of men whose families were imprisoned by their own government become the soldiers who earned more medals for their size and length of service than any other in American history? The answer begins not in Italy, but in Hawaii, on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941. This is the story of Daniel Inouye and the men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team who fought under a motto that said everything about them: go for broke, risk it all. They would risk everything again and again on battlefields most Americans have never heard of, to rescue a trapped battalion against impossible odds and to break the toughest German lines in Italy. And they would do it carrying a question no soldier should ever have to answer. What do you owe a country that has called you its enemy? To understand, we have to go back to where it began. Before we go on, if you value these forgotten stories of the men who were there, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And stay with us right to the end, because the full meaning of what Daniel Inouye did on that ridge only comes clear once you know everything he and his people endured to get there. And that story begins on the morning of December 7, 1941, in Honolulu, Hawaii, where a 17-year-old high school student was about to have his whole world and his sense of who he was turned upside down. That Sunday morning, Daniel Inouye looked up to see waves of warplanes roaring over Honolulu, their wings marked with the rising sun of Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun. Inouye, trained as a Red Cross first aid volunteer, ran to an aid station and threw himself into the work, tending the wounded and the dying as the chaos unfolded. He would labor for days almost without sleep. He was an American teenager doing everything he could for his country in its hour of crisis. But he also knew, with a sinking heart, that the planes overhead bore the symbol of the land his parents had come from. In the weeks and months that followed, fear and suspicion fell hard on Japanese Americans. Though Inouye and his family were loyal citizens, the government soon classified Japanese Americans as enemy aliens, unfit to serve in uniform. On the mainland, it went much further. Under a sweeping order, some 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, were forced from their homes and confined in remote internment camps ringed with barbed wire and guard towers. They had committed no crime. Their only offense was their ancestry. Families lost their homes, their farms, and their businesses overnight. For young men like Daniel Inouye, the insult cut deep. He was an American who wanted nothing more than to defend his country, and his country had just told him he was not fit to wear its uniform. He spent a long, bitter year enduring suspicion and questions about his loyalty. But Inouye and thousands like him refused to accept that judgment. They believed that if they were only given the chance to fight, and if they fought hard enough, they could prove once and for all that they were exactly what they had always claimed to be. Americans. They were about to get that chance. In early 1943, under mounting pressure, the government reversed course and created a new combat unit made up almost entirely of Japanese-American volunteers. It was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The call went out across Hawaii and, remarkably, into the very internment camps themselves, where young men stepped forward to fight for the country that was holding their families prisoner. Daniel Inouye set aside his medical studies and volunteered at once. What these men would do over the next 2 years would stun the United States Army and rewrite what the nation believed about loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. The response to the call was overwhelming. In Iwaki, thousands of young all-Nisei, as the American-born children of Japanese immigrants were known, rushed to volunteer. From behind the barbed wire of the camps on the mainland, more stepped forward, leaving parents and siblings still confined as they marched off to fight. It was an astonishing act of faith in a country that had given them every reason to feel betrayed. They trained relentlessly at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, determined to be not merely good soldiers, but the very best, knowing all the while that the eyes of a doubting nation were upon them. When Daniel Inouye prepared to leave, his father, an immigrant who had built a life in America, spoke to him with quiet gravity. America had been good to their family, he said. Whatever happened, his son must not bring dishonor upon his country or his family, and if he had to give his life, he should give it with honor. Those words went with Inouye to war. The men of the 442nd took as their motto a gambler's phrase from the Hawaiian docks. Go for broke. It meant to stake everything on a single roll of the dice, to hold nothing back. It would prove a grimly fitting name. In the summer of 1944, the 442nd shipped to Italy and into the heart of the war. The fighting was brutal, a grinding advance against a skilled and determined German enemy dug into hills and river lines. From the very start, the all-Nisei soldiers fought with a ferocity that startled even their own commanders. Daniel Inouye proved a natural soldier and a crack shot, and he rose quickly through the ranks to sergeant, leading first a squad and then a platoon. The men of the 442nd were paying in blood for every yard, and they were earning a reputation as some of the toughest troops in the United States Army. But the cost was savage. The 442nd was repeatedly handed the hardest assignments, the attacks others could not make, and its casualty lists grew long. These were men who carried photographs of families living in tar paper barracks behind American wire, and still they charged into German fire without flinching. Every battle was, for them, a double fight. One against the enemy in front of them, and one against the prejudice at home that whispered they could never truly be trusted. With every hill they took, they answered that whisper with their courage and far too often with their lives. By October 1904, the 442nd had been pulled out of Italy and sent north into France, to the dark, cold, rain-soaked forests of the Vosges Mountains. There, a crisis was unfolding that would test the regiment as never before. An American battalion of Texas soldiers had pushed too far ahead and been completely surrounded by German forces on a wooded ridge, cut off from rescue and running low on food, water, and ammunition. Other units had already tried to reach them and failed. Now the order came down to the weary men of the 442nd. Go and get them out, whatever it costs. They would become known to history as the Lost Battalion. More than 200 men of a Texas regiment, trapped on a forested mountainside deep in enemy territory, their perimeter shrinking as the Germans pressed in from every side. Supply planes tried to drop them food and ammunition and missed. Artillery could not break the ring around them. With each passing day, their situation grew more desperate. For the men of the 442nd, already battered from weeks of fighting, it meant attacking uphill through dense forest into prepared German positions in some of the worst conditions imaginable. What followed was 5 days of some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. The all-Nisei soldiers clawed their way up the muddy, root-tangled slopes, tree by tree and yard by yard, into machine gun fire, mortar bursts, and shells that exploded in the treetops and rained down jagged steel and splintered wood. There was often no cover and no way forward, but straight ahead. Men fell in heaps, and still the survivors pressed on, refusing to stop while American soldiers remained trapped above them. It was exactly the kind of all-or-nothing fight their motto had promised. They were going for broke. In the thick of that fighting, Daniel Inouye, now a platoon sergeant, led his men forward again and again. At one point, a German bullet struck him squarely in the chest, directly over his heart. By all rights, it should have killed him. But the round slammed into $2 he happened to be carrying stacked in his shirt pocket, and they stopped it cold. Shaken but alive, Inouye kept fighting. He carried those battered coins afterward as lucky charms, certain they had saved his life. He would lose them by a strange twist of fate, only days before the battle that would cost him his arm. At last, after 5 terrible days, the men of the 4142nd broke through and reached the trapped Texans. The survivors of the Lost Battalion, gaunt and hollow-eyed, watched in disbelief as their Japanese-American rescuers emerged from the trees. 211 men were saved, but the cost was almost beyond belief. The 4142nd had suffered far more casualties than the number of men they pulled out alive. Some companies that went into that forest 100 strong came out with only a handful of men still standing. They had bought those Texan lives with a fearful price of their own. For his leadership and courage in those desperate days, Daniel Inouye was given a battlefield commission. Promoted on the spot to second lieutenant, the youngest officer in his regiment. He had gone from a boy turned away as an enemy alien to an officer leading Americans in battle. After the Vosges, the shattered regiment went sent to rest and refit, guarding a quiet stretch of the border. But the war was not finished with Daniel Inouye. In the spring of 1945, the 442nd would be called back to Italy for one last brutal assault, and on a ridge there, Inouye would face the moment that defined his life. In April 1945, with the war in Europe almost won, the 402nd returned to Italy to help crack the Gothic Line, the last great belt of German fortifications barring the way north. On April 21, near the village of San Terenzo, Lieutenant Inouye led his platoon in an attack on a heavily defended ridge called Colle Musatello, a strong point guarding an important road. Moving fast and skillfully, his men overran an enemy artillery and mortar post and pushed to within a few dozen yards of the main German line. Then 3 hidden machine guns opened up at once, and the attack slammed to a halt in a storm of crossfire. Inouye knew that if his platoon stayed pinned in the open, they would be cut to pieces. So he went forward alone. Crawling up the treacherous slope to within a few yards of the nearest machine gun, he rose and hurled 2 grenades, destroying the position in a roar of fire. As he turned to wave his men forward, a German bullet tore into his stomach. He was badly wounded and bleeding hard, but he refused to go down. Ignoring the wound, he climbed back to his feet and kept attacking, driving his men toward the second machine gun nest as if nothing on earth could stop him. Inouye knocked out the second gun and pressed on toward the third and last. He pulled the pin on a grenade and drew back his right arm to throw. In that instant, a German rifle grenade smashed into his elbow and nearly tore the arm from his body. He looked down to see his right arm hanging by shreds, the live grenade still clenched in his ruined hand, its fuse burning down. Somehow, through unimaginable pain, he pried the grenade from his own lifeless fingers with his left hand and threw it into the enemy position, destroying it. And even then, he was not finished. Firing his weapon one-handed, Inouye fought on until a bullet through the leg finally knocked him tumbling down the slope. When his men rushed to help him, he waved them back to the fight, reportedly telling them that nobody had called off the war. The ridge was taken. Inouye's right arm could not be saved. He had won the battle and lost the very limb that was to have made him a surgeon. For their valor across the long war, the men of the 442nd would become the most decorated unit of their size in American history, their ranks studded with medals of honor and thousands of Purple Hearts. Daniel Inouye spent the next 20 months in Army hospitals, learning to live with one arm. In a hospital in Michigan, he befriended two other gravely wounded young officers, Bob Dole and Philip Hart, and remarkably, all three would one day serve together in the United States Senate. His dream of surgery was gone, so Inouye turned instead to law and then to politics. When Hawaii became a state in 1959, he was elected its first member of Congress, the first Japanese American ever to serve there, and soon after he entered the Senate, where he would serve his country for nearly half a century, until his death in 2012. For decades, the full recognition Daniel Inouye had earned on that ridge was withheld. He had received the Distinguished Service Cross, but many believe that, had he not been Japanese American, he would have been given the nation's highest honor. Finally, in the year 2000, that wrong was put right. President Clinton awarded Inouye the Medal of Honor, along with 19 other Nisei veterans of the 442nd whose heroism had gone unrewarded for far too long. More than half a century after they fought, the country they had bled for said, in full, what those men had proven all along. Daniel Inouye told his own story in his memoir, Journey to Washington. But the deeper story belongs to all the men of the 442nd. They left us with a hard and lasting question. What does a country owe the citizens it wrongs? And what makes someone keep faith with a nation that has broken faith with them? These men answered not with bitterness, but with courage, choosing to believe in an America that did not yet fully believe in them. If you had family who served in the 442nd, who fought in Italy or France, or who lived through the internment camps, share their name in the comments below and tell us one thing about them. They were not forgotten then. They will not be forgotten now. Remember them by name. Subscribe if you would like the next story.